Okay, thank you very much. My name is Adam Yates. I've been asked today to give a little bit of a talk about gas warfare. I think what's best is to give you a bit of background about myself first, just so you know who stood in front of you. Always kind of makes sense. So at first I qualified as a teacher in chemistry and physics, so I did a degree in physics first. I got that, and then did a PGCE, because that's what you have to do if you want to teach. Got a bit fed up at teaching, so I went and did some real science rather than just teach it. So I went back to university and did chemistry this time, because it seemed a little more practical than the physics I'd done in the past. So I got another BSc in that, and then once you get into university, you kind of stay there, and I then did a PhD in chemistry, and worked for, after that, for Procter & Gamble, making molecules, consumer products, and one of the products is probably in all of your kitchens, well, some people's kitchens anyway. It's the detergent in Fairy tabs, which goes in dishwashers. Unfortunately, most people actually buy Finish, so not many people actually buy the product, but if you do, I've got the patents for that, so please, next time you're there, just pushing my product, it's the platinum one, very expensive on the top shelf. Okay, please look out for it, it's really quite expensive, but it's good for removing egg from Tupperware, that's what I'm told. So then I got a doctor in that. Then I was scratching my head because there's only so much consumer chemistry you can do, and I thought I really need something else in life. So I went back to university again and decided to become a doctor. So I did that next. I was really starting getting confused with myself and all those around me. And so I ended up a double doctor, really, I suppose. And then lifelong learning, because as a doctor, it never stops. And I'm currently doing pediatrics. I'm a registrar in pediatrics now, and it's tremendous and great. So in the part-time as well, apart from that, I also am in the army as well. So I joined the reservists. And I joined the reservists when I was a medical student, so towards the latter end of my academic career, I suppose. So I joined the reservists, and because of my chemistry background and medical background, I kind of fell into CBRN, which is the chemical defense and biological side of things. It kind of seemed a good fit, and the army seemed to think so, so they sent me off on all the training courses, which has been rather splendid. So really, my true title is Captain Adam Yates today, so that's who I am. So I'm in the Royal Army Medical Corps as a doctor, and I do CBRN instructor as well, so that's where I am, and that's how I'm here to give you a talk today. So before we start, I don't know how that got there. In all things, it says, tell them what you're going to say, so that the audience there know what you're going to say. So what I'm going to talk about is frightfulness. We'll go into that in a little more detail in a little bit. Phosgene, because I like that one, because that's quite cool. I've used that in the past. Nerve agents, we'll move towards today. Then I want to have a little discussion about Syria at the end. Chemical weaponry is 100 years old now, or almost. And it's still used today as we speak in Syria. And I'd like to just go through them. There's certain bits I'm not going to talk about, and I'm very sorry, because I do love mustard gas myself. Well, not personally, but I do like the chemistry of it, and it's really quite interesting. I simply couldn't fit that in. So I apologise if anyone's here and they were wanting to know some about the medicine and the chemistry behind mustard gases. I put it down to these, and that's where we are. I thought it was important we taught nerve agents, because we're going from where we were 100 years ago to where we are today, and I think it kind of brings it all together. One point to note, there's going to be two videos that, at least the second one, you should all find quite offensive. You should find it offensive. The second video is a shot from Syria taken by a doctor with a head cam on during a chemical attack, post-chemical attack. There are scenes in there which are quite disturbing, and you should find them disturbing. If you want to leave, I'll give you the nod at that point. Then it's going to come on. It'll be at the very end of the talk. If you want to leave, you can. There are disturbing scenes in there, but you can make your choice at that point in time. I won't be offended at all, but that's where we are. So, let's start. First of all, what I want to do, I'm just going to hand out these. We're going to do a little quick chemistry lesson. Since I've been a teacher. Thank you very much. Take them. Take them across. Pass them across if you can. For them. Everyone should get one. Pass them along. Thank you very much. Pass them along. Splendid. One of them. To the left. Pass them along. Put them to the back. Everyone got one? Well, at least next to someone who's got one. So, let's talk a little bit of chemistry. And first thing I want you to do is scratch number 1 and have a little smell. And the first prize goes to the first person who can put up their hand and tell me what it smells of. Not what the chemical is, but what it smells of first, please. Anybody? Yes? Smells of almonds. Excellent. Anyone know what chemical that would be if you came across it? Excellent. Okay, let's scratch number 2. And what are we smelling? Again, please, someone put their hand up. What does number 2 smell of? Oh, did you look at it? Yeah, you have this one. Let me have that. So, what did number 2 smell of? Anyone know? Any takes? Onions. Good for it. Mustard. Garlic. So, anyone know what chemical that would be? Mustard gas. Excellent. Let's scratch the 3rd one and have a good smell. Any takers? Any takers at all? Anyone a good gardener? Is this quite flowery? Pardon? Nearly? Nearly. Come on, there must be at least someone who spent some time in the garden here. What particular flower is it? Going once? Geranium. Geranium, did someone say? Excellent. Anyone know what geraniums are from a chemical point of view? You smelled it in the air. Which chemical would you be up against? No. Geraniums is leucite, which was the British version of the mustard when we wanted to make it last a little bit longer. So it's a little more ferocious than your mustard gas, the leucite. Rather a splendid molecule, and it's also sweet. Okay, number 4, you can scratch that one. This is the last one, we're not doing 5 and 6. What does it smell of first? Come on, chaps. Aftershave. Certainly not the aftershave you went away. Anyone know? Anyone cut the grass recently? Smell of freshly cut grass. Now think about it now you've been told that. Freshly cut grass. Freshly grass. Anyone know what chemical smells of freshly cut grass? Anyone know? Freshly cut grass. If you had that smelling across you, we would be under the attack of oxygen. And we'll talk that a little bit later, but unfortunately not the mustards. Right, let's move on. So, to the British in World War I, that's the British public and the British Army, gas was universally known as frightfulness. Even after years of war and attrition and atrocities, which had seen new terror weapons such as the line and bank of the machine gun, the tank, the Zeppelin, and the U-boat, even after those had been on the scene, gas was still seen as the most hated, most feared of all of them. With a complete demonology all to itself. Chemical weapons came to epitomize all that's most evil and disgusting about war. And so we'll just plod on. Why? Because it terrified them. And it still terrifies people in Syria today. how did we get to this point? Well, we've been using on the front, the French had been, because one of their police officers said, we use tear gas, why don't we use that in war? So that kind of crept in. And the first reported attack using tear gas, or T-stop, was against the Russians in 1915. The British, we had something called South Kensington, which was also nicknamed the SK, and that was a stink bomb, and we'd been using that for quite a long time to clear out the dugouts. Throw it in, smells horrible of sulphur and egg and rotten eggs. Germans had to leave the trenches, and so we'd already been doing that. And even today, the police will use tear gas on their own people, and that's deemed acceptable. So surely then it was only a small step to go from something which is incapacitating to something that becomes lethal. And that happened on the 22nd of April, 1915, in Ypres. And unfortunately, it was against a group of French reservists in the line, and they weren't prepared at all. The Germans had decided to put over the 4-mile front 160 tons of chlorine in cylinders and let the wind blow. So if you look on here, it's along this flank here. That's where all the cylinders are, and the wind's blowing it in the direction of the French. As they weren't prepared, it ripped an enormous hole in the front line, all the way through, and hundreds upon hundreds were killed. It was more successful than the German soldiers had thought it was going to be, because they weren't prepared. Had they ripped the hole through, they had the breakthrough, which they'd been hoping for, but they did it more as an experiment rather than as a full-blown attack, and they missed their opportunity. How does it work? Well, you get, and if you can just see on the pictures here, just at the bottom here, here's your canister, and out of it, there's a little spanner, a nut, and you release it, and the pressurized chlorine gas just blows into the air. 30 parts per million, it'll give you a cough. 1 part in 1,000, it's fatal. And it gives you like an inflammatory airway, an edema, and secretions. And it's that kills you. And on a lot of reported casualties from British soldiers and French soldiers, they were reported death by drowning. It almost hides the true number of people that were actually affected by chemical. So if you go through your archives and you see death by drowning, it runs at about 10% in some of the battles. And they weren't falling into ponds. They were drowning in their own spittle. But that's how they defined it back then. So just watch out for them numbers. So 36 hours after the first German attack, Canadian troops were moved in to fill this hole. The British thought, so they had to fill the lines. And there's this famous painting by Richard Jack, Through Clouded Eyes. And unfortunately, 36 hours later, the wind was in the right direction again. And down it came. They were told to urinate on socks, put them in their mouths if there was another gas attack, and certainly not try and run away. Anyone think of why they were told not to try and run away? Because you'll breathe faster, you'll take a deeper breath, and it's more likely to do more damage. So unfortunately, that's what they were told, and that's not very nice. And again, there was many casualties, many difficulties, and Britain had to do something about this quick because we couldn't take this kind of hit much longer. The Daily Mail, wonderful newspaper. Lord Northcliffe appealed in the Daily Mail for the women of England to make respirators out of simple cotton wool in a gauze envelope. And many million were supplied. Fortunately, they didn't get to be used because they were useless when they were dry, and when they were dipped in the water, you drowned and couldn't breathe through them. So we then needed another approach. Luckily, there were no more attacks after the 24th of May. Anyone know why? Why? Winter was away. So the winter winds had turned. Unfortunately, we had quite literally a bit of breathing space. So who did we get? We went to Prof. Haldane. Now this chap was a chap who invented the, he was a deep sea diver, and he was a respiratory physician, and he invented the compression chamber for once you've been deep sea diving. As he knew a lot about respiration, the country turned to this chap to try and help us with the respirator. And the first ones he produced, was nothing more than a sackcloth with a hole in it. Now, it was impregnated against the chlorine, but there's a fundamental problem with this mask. Can anyone see? It does. Steams up, can't see. Then you'd sweat in it, and the chemical then would run down your face and into your eyes and sting as well. There's another problem, a medical problem with this. There's no respiratory outlet, so you will get a buildup of carbon dioxide. So you can't be in it for long before you start struggling. So he moved on to the next. This was the Hochstein. This is a photo here showing all different designs, but we'll move on to ones for dogs as well. And this is the next one. So after the sackcloth, well, that was the sackcloth we've just put on there. They made 2.5 million of these H helmets, which was the first one you've just seen. Bags of flannel, impregnated against chlorine, with a couple of eyepieces or one eyepiece. By December 1915, we'd moved on to the P helmet, because we'd realised that you can't last long with your carbon dioxide level building up inside your mask. So this allows you to breathe out, and when you try and breathe in, it sucks in. So it stops the air coming in, it preserves the oxygen that's within you, but more importantly, it allows the carbon dioxide out. And there was a football match done to show that the players could run around and play football in these helmets, so you can jolly well sit in your trench and last a while. That was the argument anyway. And therefore, you could operate your machine gun. And that's where we went. Thank you very much. The problem with it is, if you're trying to operate your machine gun, there's big blind spots on here, so your accuracy is quite diminished. But at least you were able to hold the line. Now, how did the Germans come up with what they've come up with? Well, for them, fortunately for them, and unfortunately for us, they had this chap. Anyone know who this chap is? He's known as the father of chemical weapons. I do like his glasses. His name is Fitzhaber, of the Born-Haber cycle. He was tasked initially to try and make fertilizer and also the nitrates required for explosives. Because of the blockade by sea, Germany had to turn to their resources within and make synthetic fertilizers and synthetic nitrates for their explosives. Fortunately for them, they had Haber, who was a brilliant chemist. He is known as the godfather of the father of chemical weapons. He was 40 years old at the time, and he was able to use his knowledge of chemistry to form the first chemical weapons. He won a Nobel Prize for chemistry even after the war, and that was because of his work on fertilizers. There was a big hoo-ha, should he have won a Nobel Prize, as he'd also invented chemical weapons. But on balance, he'd saved more lives than he'd killed, because he'd made fertilizer for the planet, which allows us to feed the world as we do today. He did have a personal loss. His wife could not cope with what he was doing. And on one trip to Russia, where they were where he was overseeing the deployment of some chemical weapons. She killed herself because she couldn't cope with the shame of what her husband was doing. So there was a bit of personal loss for him as well. If Harbour was the father of chemical weapons, then this chap was the godfather of chemical weapons. This guy was Carl Duisberg. He was the head of an IG cartel. Now, this was an enormous chemical industry. It was actually 8 companies merged together to make the synthetic nitrates for the German war effort. He had a vested interest financially in chemical weapons because his dye industry was almost at a standstill since the start of the war, and he needed to use them resources in another way. And through Harbour, he was able to utilize that unused resource, make some money out of it, and the resulting chemistry was to be seen. This chap isn't from the First World War, but he's another brilliant German chemist. He's called Gerhard Schreider. We'll talk about him later in 1936. This chap invented the nerve agent. So you can see a large German chemist background here in making these weapons. This is what the Germans had. We had nothing like this. ICI was not yet fully established. We had some small petrochemical, a very small petrochemical industry, very small dye industry at the time, and we were on the back foot. The Germans could turn out thousands of tons of the chemical weapons. We had a few small dye industry companies that were disjointed, and part of the war effort actually brought them all together to form ICI, the fledgling of ICI as it later became. But what did Britain do? Well, we were also against the PPE, personal protective equipment. Here's a photo of the Germans when they're releasing their chemicals. They might be on horse and cart, or cart at the back there, but if you look at their respirators and you look at their personal equipment, they were far ahead of us in the game. So they had less injuries when they were deploying their chemical weapons than we did as well, simply because they had had a few years to design the synthesis and know of the consequences for the operators. So what did Britain do? Well, we turned to a chap I'd love to have met, Captain Charles Fuchs of the Royal Engineers. This chap was a big game hunter. And the story goes that bearing the telltale signs of mud and barbed wire, on the 26th of May 1915, he goes and meets General Robertson at the Advanced HQ in Hazebrook, and it's a very short conversation. "Do you know anything about gas?" he said in his memoirs. "Nothing at all." "Well, I don't think it matters. I want you to take charge of our gas reprisals here in France. Something's going on in London. You must cross over, find out all about it, then come back here and tell me what you propose to do. You're dismissed." Now, to most people, that would be a terrifying proposition from their senior commander. However, this guy's almost from the pages of Kipling. 40 years old, the 7th son of a chaplain in India, all who'd grown up to serve in the empire, and 5 of them were already buried overseas. He'd spent 23 years in the army in Sierra Leone, Gambia, the Gold Coast, South Africa, West Indies, and others. He devised the bicycle-mounted photo reconnaissance team in the Boer War. And most of those were children. He was a big game hunter, a first division footballer, competed in the 1908 Olympic Games. He ended up being the ADC to the king, and at the grand age of 95 years old, the year that men landed on the moon, he died peacefully in his bed. What he does in 5 months is quite remarkable. He has to form the special brigade. So he goes to all the chemists in all the universities and he wants patriotic scientists. He gives them all extra pay, gives them all increased rank, and he turns to the dye industry because he knows that's where the capability is in order to make it. In 5 months' time, he's recruited 1,404 men, 57 officers. There's no parade ground for these guys. They only have to carry revolvers. And after the war, these are the key figures in establishing the fledgling ICI. Battle of Loos, 25th of September. He's managed to create 5,500 chlorine cylinders, which is equivalent to about 150 tons of gas. This is no small feat for a chap who 5 months before didn't know anything about gas. 50,000 German casualties that day. Unfortunately, there were also 2,000 British. 55 were severely injured and 10 died. On the back of that, we had to learn fast. And that's when we set up the Allied School for Gas, which is still in existence on Salisbury Plains at Winterburn Gunner, where we train people on how to put on their respirators properly and how to defend themselves against chemical weapons. This was the start of a whole new branch of the army in just 5 months' time. Quite a remarkable effort. So, what happened then? Because we now had chemical weapons. Obviously, not to the scale of the German manufacturers, but we had them. And it turned into a World War I stalemate. Why? Well, like all stalemates, the Germans initiate use of a gas, of a new gas, to try and break through. Fails because they just doesn't penetrate the hull, or they don't put enough emphasis behind the breakthrough each time. And then the British would copy it and use it against the Germans. Interestingly, each time we tried our new weapons, or the mustard, or the phosgene, the Germans were as unprepared as we were on the initial attacks. And unfortunately, in the Battle of Loos, which is unfortunately very flat ground, the wind wasn't particularly in our favour, and the high command of the British Army didn't want to put a large push through the hole that we created. So we ended up in this stalemate of attrition, really. I want to talk to you now about phosgene, because that was the next generation after the chlorine gas from the cylinders. Let me tell you about phosgene. There's the first phosgene attack against German soldiers that we deployed. There's some of the photographic evidence. It's rather a special molecule. There's the World War II poster, which was out because we didn't know if that was going to happen. So that's the hay smell we saw before. There's a poster warning people against the smell of hay when they had the gas mask. The molecule's quite simple, really. It's just got a carbonyl group and 2 chlorines on it. Quite simple one, used in the dye industry and used today in the manufacture of detergents. And I've used it on many times as well myself. Very handy molecule, very active. It's 18 times more potent than chlorine. Unfortunately, we had the H helmet just in time. We knew phosgene was going to be used because we had some of it ourselves, and we knew that the current H-type helmet was not going to be sufficient, and we changed the design and the chemicals we impregnated against in order to protect ourselves from phosgene, and it did come just in time, really, for the first attack. In the presence of water, that's your sweat, saliva, or tears, the liquid or the gas, as it hydrolyzes to form you hydrochloric acid, which can irritate and damage your cells. A byproduct from the synthesis of it is you'll always have some chlorine in there as well, so you get a double whammy there, and there'll always be at least a trace of chlorine in there. The exposure to phosgene results in a reactive airway dysfunction syndrome. So in simple terms, it gives you an irritant-type asthma attack as it attacks the airways. picture quite similar to an asthma attack. This is the interesting bit, though, which caught everybody out. At low levels, where you can just smell it like you did today, just gentle smell, for an interval of 30 minutes to 48 hours, you'll feel fine. The carbonyl group, however, that's the C-double bond O bit, gets taken down into the lungs, right deep into the lungs, and it can undergo acylation reactions. So that basically means the proteins can come in and react with that acylation group deep down in the linings of the lungs. It then causes fluid from the capillaries to leak into the interstitial portion of the lung, and your lymphatic drainage, which removes fluid generally from the body, becomes progressively overwhelmed, and the fluid then builds up in the lungs, and you end up getting what we describe, I suppose, as a pulmonary edema picture. But that takes time, and that caused a lot of problems for the triage system, which we were employing at the time, because you didn't know who was well and who wasn't. And we sent plenty of men back to the front, thinking they were well, and 48 hours, they were dead at the post. The pulmonary edema comes on very, very quickly. There's another story of a German that was taken prisoner after we'd done a phosgene attack. And he was saying how poor our own phosgene was compared to theirs. And a few hours later, he'd also died from pulmonary edema. And this, it took some time, and it was baffling the medics and the chemists as to why this was, but it did change the triage system once they knew that phosgene had been deployed. Now, phosgene today, you'd think, ooh, that must be a dangerous chemical. Just go and buy it on the internet, guys. It's not particularly restricted. Very surprising. So you can go on, nice, email us, click here, you can just buy it. And buy yourself a nice cylinder there that you can see. And yeah, I'm surprised that we've not seen it more in the news. So let's move on then. So that's the history of the phosgene and the chlorine and the start of the history of frightfulness. I want to move on now to these two chaps, Tavun and Sarin. This goes back to that chap we saw before, Jared Schreider. He made a remarkable discovery in 1936. He was making organophosphate compounds, and he had to stop for 3 weeks because he couldn't see. It contracts the eyes. He was finding it impossible to work in light, and he was having an acute breathing difficulty. Then when he purified it, he found it was of no use at all as an insecticide because everything he tried it on died within 20 minutes. Unfortunately, the Wehrmacht were impressed, and they started a monthly capacity of about 3,000 tons of this nerve gas. We knew about it. MI19, who are the interrogation group, picked up a chemist, an unknown German chemist, and he told them about the synthesis, so this is in the Second World War now, he told them of the synthesis of Trillion 83. Trillion 83 was a code name. Now, Trillion is a synthetic detergent as well, but 83 wasn't. 83 was a nerve agent, and he explained this to our chaps at Porton Down after interrogation, and the chaps at Porton Down made some, but decided that the scale-up of it was going to be far too tricky for the Germans to do, so really, there's nothing really to be bothered about. Little did we know that Hitler had a 3,000-ton supply every month being delivered to the forward lines. However, fortunately, he didn't use it. One of the reasons he didn't use it was, fortunately, the Americans were looking at organophosphates as an insecticide, so they pulled all the patents at that time off organophosphates. They were making DDT. So they didn't want anyone to know what was going on, so the literature went quiet. Now, the German chemists thought, as the literature's gone quiet, they must also have nerve agents too. And they managed to convince Hitler that if he deployed his nerve agents, then the Allies would deploy theirs as well, because they're obviously working on them. It was a standoff that never needed to happen. We never had it. Fortunately, they never deployed it, and it was then just put back to history. The Allies were astounded at the quantity of nerve gas when they finally won the war in 1945. So let's just have a look at this. Interesting molecule shapes. Look on this one here, they're all organophosphates. So there's your phosphate, double bond O, phosphate, double bond O, phosphate, double bond O, phosphate, double bond O, and there's the names at the top. This was the first one that was made, Taboo, and VX was the one that was developed by our friends at Porton Down, and it's the one that's probably deployed today. It's the most efficient because it's not as volatile as the others, so it persists longer. As gases, they have a density greater than air, so as it persists, so they accumulate in low places. So the advice is on a nerve agent attack is to get yourselves upstairs, so it will lie in the lower regions of basements, etc. They can penetrate clothing, skin, mucous membranes. Because of the fatty groups up on here, they can easily be absorbed. And there's the American stockpile of VX. That's an unknown place. Plenty of shells there. Probably enough to wipe out most of Europe there. So the symptoms of a nerve agent attack are what we call mnemonic dumbbells. So it gives you diarrhea, urination, meiosis, where your eyes go small, bradycardia, slow heart, bronchochorea, so that's secretions, emesis, so you're thrown up, lacrimator from the eyes, and salivation. That's from the muscarinic receptors. You've also got nicotinic receptors, which give you muscle pain, tremors, weakness, high blood pressure, and fasciculations, flickering of the skin. And then you've got a central nervous effect as well. So you're being hit on 3 counts here, and that will give you a headache, agitation, confusion, vertigo, seizures, and a coma. I'm going to play a video now, short video. It's some VX on a rabbit on the skin. If anyone's got any objections, please put your hand up. Okay. It's only a very short video. Sound as well? Yep.
Rabbit number 2 has a clip spot on his back exposing the skin. The animal is removed from the cage, placed on the table, and a small drop of the VX is placed on the clipped area at 0900 hours. The animal is replaced in the cage and observed for symptoms. This rabbit is a sacrifice to show beginning symptoms to death. VX is a delayed-acting casualty agent, taking from 3 to 15 minutes to penetrate the skin and produce symptoms. The first symptom observed in the bunny is the slow pinpointing of the pupils of the eye. Second symptoms observed are the twitching of the back muscles where the VX was applied. Anxiety, jitteriness, generalized weakness, and convulsions follow. Often before death, abnormal urination and defecation take place. rabbit is dead in 15 minutes. Rabbit number 3
Okay, we'll
is
stop
removed
there.
from the cage.
Thank you very much. So that shows you the three approaches which I just talked about there. The muscarinic, you saw that. Well, it was difficult to see the meiosis. You saw the urination and the diarrhea from the rabbit. The nicotinic receptors are the more obvious ones. That shows you the muscle pain, the tremors, and the fasciculations. The central nervous ones we saw is when the rabbit there moves into a seizure and then a coma, and that's the later sign. You end up dying of respiratory failure, driven from these three parts, from the three different receptors, really. You get the bronchospasm, you get the muscle paralysis, so you can't breathe, and then you get depression centrally on your respiratory drive, so you can't breathe, so you don't have that desire to breathe as well. How does it work? Okay, let's do a little bit of biochemistry here. So this shows a synapse. So this is your nerves, one end to the other, and it's got to send a message across, and the message is the neurotransmitter that sends the message across. So if a muscle wants to work, it needs to send a message across using the neurotransmission, and that message then is delivered to generate a response. And it moves across like that, binds on the side, and then you get the message. So if you just see, as it goes across, you get the message sent. The molecule is acetyl esterase, and this is the molecule that breaks up the neurotransmitter, which is there, into two little bits, so it doesn't build up. So you see, it has it. It's an enzyme. It binds to the neurotransmitter, breaks it up into the little parts, and then it gets the next one, breaks it up into the parts, gets the next one, and then the neuron on the left-hand side, as it's moving across to the right, has to then generate some more, and then they move across. Now, when you have a nerve gas, the acetylcholine, which breaks up this response, is blocked by the nerve agent. So the nerve agent gets the acetylcholine esterase and blocks it. So what you do have then is, instead of it being broken up, the neurotransmitter, the choline, you get overload, and you get mass of signal being sent, which gives you the spasm, or just causes havoc within the central nervous system, and it prevents it. So that's in a simple way. I'd like to put up a little bit of chemistry, because I'm obviously a chemist at heart. This is the acetylcholine enzyme, so if you can imagine that, which I've just drawn there, with an iso-H group on there. There's your nerve agent. The OH group on here can attack this phospho group there. And when that happens, you get a covalent bond formed here, which is in the red, and it blocked the enzyme. That's in the simple terms. Once it's blocked the enzyme, that enzyme cannot then do its job and break up the neurotransmitters in the synapse. So that builds up and causes all the problems. And it also delivers HF as part of the process there, as it drives it through. Now, we need antidotes then for this then to work, to prevent this from happening. And the first thing you have to do is decontaminate with water. So if we have a attack with nerve agents today, this is what you'd do if you had the facilities. You'd have people in protective equipment, and this is a young girl here, and she's been washed down all nicely in a very controlled environment, in a practice run, and she's been able to be decontaminated. And there she is afterwards, showing that she's not harmed. The medicines we use are atropine. Now that one works by blocking the acetylcholine receptors, and it helps with the bronchial secretions. So it's most effective on the muscarinic receptors we talked before. So that will help with the bronchial secretions. There's another one called 2-PAM, we call it. And this works by reactivating the poisoned acetylcholine esterase. So you've got that enzyme and it's been poisoned, and this molecule moves in to try and regenerate the enzyme. But it takes time to react because it's got to get in there and compete with the nerve agent, which is already bound to the enzyme. So it takes longer to work. So you've got to really get that in sooner, as soon as possible. And the other one is a preventer. And these are called NAPs, and these are used by soldiers today if they're going into battle and they think they're going to be exposed by chemical weapons. And it's a pre-treatment. So you'll give it your soldiers before. It's about 30 milligrams, and you take it every 8 hours. And this binds to the enzyme, which the nerve agent was going to bind to. But the good thing is it just temporarily blocks it, so then it can still be used. So it's almost like a temporary binder, so the nerve agent can't get in, but then can be regenerated much easier from the body. And so they're the three approaches that we have. How do we give these antidotes? Well, we give the antidotes depending on if you've got mild or severe symptoms. The severe symptom is coma, breathing problems, and convulsions. You give that 2-PAM as soon as possible, because that's the one that's going to try and compete with the poisoned enzyme. And you give a single dose, about 300 mils saline. And for a child, because I'm a pediatrician now, the dose is, as you see there, 15 milligrams per kilogram or 25 milligrams per kilogram, depending if it's severe in the red or mild symptoms. Then you give atropine, and you give atropine, as it shows there, depending on the weight of the child, and also depends on the severity of the symptoms. The frequency of the atropine is given every 5 minutes. In a triage situation, that's not easy to do, especially if you've got multiple casualties. So you've basically got to try and line your casualties up on the ground, stab them with the atropine, notice their symptoms, go back 5 minutes later and stab them again in the leg, and keep this going. But you must stop when they show that their respiratory drive has improved. What you mustn't do is look at the heart rate or look at the meiosis, the small of the eyes. You will poison them with atropine if you try and treat the narrowed pupils. And that's happened in the past, where doctors have continued to prescribe the atropine, and then you end up being poisoned by it. So you give the atropine, you give it regularly, but you just do it for respiratory drive and nothing else. Further treatments, if you've got seizures which are not responding, then you can give some diazepam, and give it rectally, of course, because you're in a triage situation. You don't want to be bothered about getting IV access, so you can just put that in the rectum, and ferritin, which we often use for children in seizures, is simply not effective. Diazepam is the way forward. And if you've only got the localized eye problems, because you may just have many casualties who've just got the meiosis, the small pupils, as I say, that's the most sensitive and the last thing to be cured. You can just give them some eye drops for that and get them out of the arena, so you can concentrate on those more severely injured. You can also give an ipratropium inhaler. We give that for asthma, and that has been given in the past when they've had problems with bronchospasm. And maybe some people in the audience take that for their asthma on an ongoing basis. So that's the end of my talk, really. I'll tell you what I've said. We talked briefly about the frightfulness, how horrific it must have been. I tried to give you an introduction to phosgene, and that it's still widely available chemical today. we've taught the nerve agents. I hope I've not blinded you too much with some chemistry and the physiology there, but I thought it was important. And what I'd like to talk to now is show you a video about an attack in Syria, which happened. If anyone would like to leave the room, they're more than welcome to. This video contains images of children under duress being treated following a nerve agent attack last year. So I will not object at all if anyone wants to leave. In the past, when people have seen this, there have been some people who've been upset, but I'm just giving you a warning of what there is. I think it's important because I can't bring you the 100 Years' War to here today to see what it was like in Ypres for them people. We didn't have video cameras there. We've just got snapshots and old photographs of soldiers that died. But today, with technology, we can see what it was like in the field hospital where this took place. Now, the doctor that took these images had it on a head cam. They were not expecting a chemical attack. They were caught out, just like 100 years ago when the poor doctors there were caught out by chlorine attack and the phosgene attacks. The triage system collapses, as you will see, because you're simply not prepared. The chemicals, the treatments that they're giving are the right things. You'll see them trying to give the treatment. It's just being given haphazard, and they've been overwhelmed. This is in the basement of a shopping mall where they'd set up a temporary field hospital for the ongoing hostilities just outside Damascus. The doctors that are there were all volunteers. They were there to help with the war effort for the Syrian population. They did not expect a chemical attack, but they did have some atropine, and you'll see atropine being given, but they had little else. Okay, let me just play this. Okay, and so it goes on. Very disturbing scenes. You can imagine it's almost like a field ambulance situation there. They're in a forward operating base, as we'd call it today from an army point of view. They're at the front line. They've been overcome by an unexpected event. Their triage system has completely collapsed, and they're trying to do the best they can. I'd like to think we do things a little bit better, but it's hard for us to say that and judge in a nice, comfortable environment like this. However, what they shouldn't be doing there is doing IV access and spending and wasting their time doing IV access. They should just be injecting into the muscles, lining them up, noting them, and then going back and injecting back into the muscles. They've got themselves in a loop there where they've forgotten about the airway, breathing, and circulation. They're trying to just treat the circulation because something they feel they can do by just putting in the IV access, but it's not the right treatment. I'm sorry to finish it on such a sad note that way, but at the end of the day, chemical weapons is not pleasant. And to say what we said at the beginning, they do epitomise all that is most disgusting and evil about war. Thank you very much.